Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my channel Roots of Fear. During the winter of 1847, a young woman named Latoya was admitted to the Blessed Mercy Infirmary, a religious hospital run by Protestant ministers, in a small town outside Salem, Massachusetts. What transpired over her 37 days of treatment proved so disturbing that the attending physicians burned most of their records. Only one doctor's personal journal survived, concealed in his family's attic for more than a century. The case file, stamped confidential and ordered never to be discussed, held details that challenged everything the medical community believed about the human mind and soul. Local church leaders pressured the hospital to seal the records permanently. And 3 of the 7 doctors who treated Latoya left Massachusetts within 6 months, never to practice medicine again. What you're about to hear has never been told in its entirety until now. If you're brave enough to uncover the darkest secrets that religious institutions tried to bury, hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those who dare to seek the truth that others fear to tell. The story begins with what seemed like a routine admission to a hospital that prided itself on combining Christian compassion with the latest medical knowledge of the time. The town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, sat like a watchful sentinel 15 miles northwest of Salem. Its white-steepled churches rising above modest wooden homes that housed barely 800 souls. In 1847, the community remained deeply divided between the established Congregationalist families who had founded the settlement in 1692 and the growing number of Irish Catholic immigrants who had arrived seeking work in the textile mills along the Mary River. The Blessed Mercy Infirmary stood at the heart of this tension, a 3-story brick building erected in 1834 by Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore, a stern Congregationalist minister who believed that healing the body required first purifying the soul. The hospital's 20-bed capacity made it the largest medical facility between Boston and the New Hampshire border, attracting patients from across Essex County. Its staff of 7 physicians, all Protestant men trained at Harvard Medical School, prided themselves on applying both scientific method and Christian principles to their practice. Dr. Jonathan Aldridge, the hospital's chief physician, had studied under the renowned alienist Dr. Samuel Woodward at Worcester State Hospital. At 34, Aldridge possessed a methodical mind and an unwavering faith in both medical progress and divine providence. His colleagues respected his innovative approaches to treating what they called disorders of the mind, conditions that other physicians often dismissed as mere moral failings or demonic possession. The hospital's daily routine began at 5 o'clock in the morning with communal prayer, followed by rounds that concluded each evening with scripture reading. Patients, regardless of their religious background, were expected to participate in these Christian observances. The nuns of the nearby Sacred Heart Convent, despite their Catholic faith, were permitted to provide nursing care due to their medical training, a controversial arrangement that sparked heated debates in the town's Protestant churches. Dr. Aldridge maintained meticulous records of every patient, filling leather-bound journals with detailed observations about symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. His personal study, located on the hospital's 3rd floor, contained hundreds of these volumes dating back to the institution's founding. He believed that understanding the human condition required documenting not just physical ailments, but the spiritual and emotional struggles that accompanied them. The winter of 1847 had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping below freezing for weeks at a time. The hospital's coal-burning furnaces struggled to heat the building's drafty corridors, and the constant smell of carbolic acid mixed with wood smoke created an atmosphere that patients often described as oppressive. It was into this environment that Latoya would arrive, carrying with her a mystery that would challenge everything the medical staff believed about the nature of human suffering. On the morning of January 15, 1847, a horse-drawn carriage struggled through the snow-covered streets of Millbrook, carrying a young woman who would soon become the subject of the most disturbing case in the hospital's history. Latoya appeared to be in her early 20s with dark hair and olive skin that suggested mixed ancestry, a detail that would later prove significant in the prejudiced atmosphere of 1847 Massachusetts. She'd been found 3 days earlier by a farmer named Silas Hartwell, discovered unconscious in his barn, wearing only a thin cotton dress despite the frigid temperatures. When she regained consciousness, she spoke in whispers, claiming to remember nothing of how she had arrived there. Her only possessions were a small leather pouch containing 7 silver coins and a peculiar brass locket that bore no identifying marks. Dr. Aldridge's first examination revealed a patient in remarkable physical condition despite her ordeal. Her vital signs were normal, her reflexes sharp, and she showed no signs of frostbite or malnutrition. However, her behavior immediately struck him as unusual. She would only speak when directly addressed, answered questions with unsettling precision, and displayed an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings. When he asked her full name, she responded simply, "Latoya," nothing more. The most puzzling aspect of her case emerged during the intake process. When asked about her religious background, Latoya's demeanor changed dramatically. Her hands began to tremble, her breathing became labored, and she whispered in what Dr. Aldridge initially assumed was Latin. However, Dr. Marcus Brennan, the hospital's youngest physician who had studied classical languages at Harvard, quickly realized she was speaking in a dialect he couldn't identify. The words don't follow Latin grammar, Dr. Brennan noted in his report. They seem to be a mixture of several languages, possibly including elements of what might be African or Caribbean dialects. The patient delivers them with such fluency that it appears to be her native tongue. Yet, when questioned about the language, she claims no knowledge of speaking anything other than English. During her first night at the hospital, the nursing staff reported unusual occurrences. Sister Mary Catherine, a nun from the Sacred Heart Convent, noted that Latoya seemed to anticipate events before they happened. She would sit up in bed moments before the night watchman made his rounds, would request water precisely when the well needed to be drawn, and would wake from sleep just as the church bells began to chime, as if some internal clock guided her actions. More disturbing were the reports from other patients. Mrs. Zelina Hitchcock, a 50-year-old woman recovering from pneumonia, claimed that Latoya had spoken to her in her sleep, describing in perfect detail the death of Mrs. Hitchcock's husband 5 years earlier, details that had never been shared with anyone at the hospital. When questioned, Latoya insisted she had never spoken to Mrs. Hitchcock and had no knowledge of any deceased husband. Dr. Aldridge initially dismissed these accounts as the delusions of sick minds, but his skepticism began to waver when he witnessed something that challenged his rational worldview. On the evening of January 18, while conducting his final rounds, he observed Latoya sitting upright in her bed, eyes closed, speaking in the same unknown language she had used during her intake. Her voice carried through the ward with an eerie clarity, and as she spoke, every patient in the surrounding beds began to stir restlessly. The most unsettling detail came from Thomas Brewster, a young man recovering from a severe leg injury. He later told Dr. Aldridge that as Latoya spoke, he began to see vivid images in his mind, scenes of a tropical landscape he had never visited, of people performing rituals around a fire, of ceremonies that seemed both ancient and forbidden. When Latoya suddenly stopped speaking and opened her eyes, Brewster found himself crying, though he couldn't explain why. Dr. Aldridge documented this incident in his personal journal, noting, "The patient exhibits behaviors that challenge our understanding of mental disorders. While she shows no signs of traditional hysteria or melancholia, her presence seems to affect other patients in ways that medical science cannot adequately explain. I find myself torn between my scientific training and observations that suggest phenomena beyond our current comprehension." The hospital's routine began to shift around Latoya's presence. Nurses reported that their normal duties seemed to flow more smoothly when she was calm, but became increasingly difficult when she showed signs of distress. The building's coal furnaces, which had struggled all winter, began to maintain consistent temperatures. Even the hospital's chronic rat problem seemed to disappear during her first week of residency. These changes did not go unnoticed by Reverend Whitmore, who visited the hospital twice weekly to provide spiritual guidance to patients and staff. During his January 20th visit, he spent nearly an hour speaking with Latoya in the hospital's small chapel. Hospital staff later reported seeing the Reverend emerge from the chapel with a visibly shaken expression, his hands trembling as he gathered his prayer book and coat. When Dr. Aldridge asked about the meeting, Reverend Whitmore's response was cryptic. "That young woman possesses knowledge that no Christian soul should carry." I fear we are dealing with something that extends beyond medical science into realms where only God's judgment can provide answers. The Reverend's concerns proved prophetic. Within days of his visit, the hospital would experience events that would test the faith and sanity of everyone involved in Latoya's care. The days following Reverend Whitmore's disturbing encounter with Latoya brought subtle but undeniable changes to the Blessed Mercy Infirmary. Dr. Aldridge, a man who prided himself on rational observation, began to notice patterns that defied medical explanation. Patients who had been bedridden for weeks suddenly showed marked improvement when Latoya was moved to the bed adjacent to theirs. Conversely, those who complained of her presence experienced setbacks that seemed to correlate directly with their level of discomfort around her. Dr. Brennan, whose curiosity about Latoya's mysterious language had initially driven him to research classical texts, made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his career. In a collection of maritime records at the Salem Historical Society, he found references to a slave ship called the Esperanza that had wrecked off the Massachusetts coast in 1823. Among the rescued survivors was a young woman described as speaking in tongues unknown to Christian ears and possessing knowledge of healing arts that seemed to transcend natural philosophy. The ship's manifest, written in faded ink, listed among its human cargo a girl named Latoya, approximately 4 years old at the time of the wreck. According to the records, she had been placed in the care of a Presbyterian family in nearby Peabody, but had disappeared from their home 3 years later, leaving behind only a note written in the same incomprehensible language that Dr. Brennan had heard her speak. The implications are staggering, Dr. Brennan wrote in his private correspondence to a colleague at Harvard. If this is indeed the same individual, she would now be 28 years old. Yet, our patient appears no older than 22. Furthermore, the records indicate she was placed with a family known for their rigid Christian beliefs. How then did she acquire knowledge of what appears to be African spiritual practices? Dr. Aldridge initially dismissed his colleague's theory as coincidental. However, when he mentioned the slave ship records to Latoya during one of their daily sessions, her reaction was immediate and profound. She began to speak rapidly in the unknown language, tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching the brass locket that had been her only possession when found. For the first time since her arrival, Latoya volunteered information about her past. She spoke of memories that seemed to exist in fragments, a ship tossing in violent seas, the sound of chains, the smell of death, and voices calling out in languages she understood but could not name. She described being taken to a house where the people tried to wash away what I was, and of running into the woods where she lived with those who remembered the old ways. I don't age as others do, she whispered to Dr. Aldridge during one of their sessions. Time moves differently for those who carry the weight of generations. I remember being young, but I also remember being old. I remember dying, but I also remember being born. The line between past and present dissolved long ago. Dr. Aldridge documented these conversations with growing unease. As a man of science, he sought rational explanations for what he observed. Perhaps Latoya suffered from a form of dissociative disorder, creating elaborate fantasies to cope with childhood trauma. Yet her knowledge of specific historical events, her ability to predict minor occurrences within the hospital, and her profound effect on other patients suggested something far more complex. The hospital's staff began to divide into two camps, those who viewed Latoya as a fascinating medical case requiring careful study and those who whispered that she brought an unholy presence into their Christian institution. Sister Mary Catherine, despite her Catholic training which emphasized the reality of spiritual mysteries, found herself drawn to the scientific perspective. I have witnessed what the Church calls miracles, she confided to Dr. Aldridge. I have seen the power of prayer heal the sick and comfort the dying. But what I observe in this young woman's presence feels different, ancient, primal, connected to forces that existed long before Christ walked the earth. It doesn't feel evil, but it doesn't feel wholly good either. It simply feels old. The tension within the hospital reached a breaking point when Mrs. Hitchcock, the pneumonia patient who had claimed Latoya spoke to her of her dead husband, made a request that shocked the entire staff. She asked to be moved to the bed directly next to Latoya's, claiming that the young woman's presence brought her dreams of her husband that felt more real than any memory. "She doesn't just speak to me," Mrs. Hitchcock explained to Dr. Aldridge. "She helps me remember things I thought I had forgotten." The way Samuel laughed when he was truly happy. The songs he used to hum while working in the garden. The exact words he spoke to me on our wedding day. It's as if she can reach into the past and bring back pieces of it. Dr. Aldridge reluctantly agreed to the room change, but the consequences proved more significant than anyone anticipated. Other patients began requesting similar arrangements, drawn by reports of vivid dreams, sudden improvements in their conditions, and what they described as a sense of peace they had never experienced before. However, not all reactions were positive. Jacob Morrison, a merchant recovering from a severe bout of dysentery, became increasingly agitated in Latoya's presence. He complained of nightmares featuring scenes of violence and suffering, images of people in chains, and voices crying out in anguish. His condition worsened to the point where Dr. Aldridge was forced to move him to a different wing of the hospital. "She brings the sins of the past with her," Morrison told Dr. Aldridge during one of his more lucid moments. "I see things in my dreams that I know I've never witnessed, but they feel like memories. I see myself as someone else, someone who did terrible things. I can't escape the guilt of actions I never took." These polarized reactions created an atmosphere of tension that permeated the entire hospital. Staff members began to avoid Latoya's wing during their off-duty hours, while others found excuses to linger near her room. Dr. Aldridge noticed that younger staff members seemed less affected by her presence, while older employees, particularly those with strong religious convictions, showed signs of increasing anxiety. The situation became more complex when Reverend Whitmore returned to the hospital for his weekly visit. This time he brought with him two other ministers, Reverend Isaiah Blackwood from the First Baptist Church and Reverend Cornelius Marsh from the Methodist congregation. Together they requested a private meeting with Dr. Aldridge to discuss what they termed a matter of grave spiritual concern. "We have reason to believe," Reverend Whitmore began, his voice barely above a whisper, "that your patient may be practicing forms of worship that are not only unchristian, but actively harmful to the spiritual well-being of others. We have received reports from family members of patients who claim their loved ones have been speaking about dreams and visions that bear no resemblance to Christian revelation." Dr. Aldridge found himself caught between his medical oath and the religious authority that funded his hospital. The minister's concerns were not entirely unfounded. He had observed changes in patients that defied medical explanation. Yet he also recognized that Latoya showed no signs of deliberate malice or manipulation. If anything, she seemed as puzzled by the effects of her presence as everyone else. The meeting concluded with an agreement that would prove to be a turning point in the case. The ministers would be permitted to observe Latoya's interactions with patients while Dr. Aldridge would be allowed to continue his medical evaluation without interference. Neither party anticipated how this compromise would lead to discoveries that would challenge both scientific and religious understanding of human nature. The joint observation period began on February 1, 1847 with Dr. Aldridge and the three ministers establishing a careful protocol for monitoring Latoya's interactions with patients and staff. What they discovered during the following weeks would fundamentally alter their understanding of the case and raise questions that none of them felt prepared to answer. Reverend Blackwood, whose Baptist background emphasized the importance of personal spiritual experience, was the first to notice what he termed synchronicities in Latoya's behavior. She would begin speaking in the unknown language precisely when patients were experiencing moments of deep emotional distress, almost as if she could sense their internal states. More remarkably, her words seemed to have a calming effect even on patients who couldn't understand them. "I must confess," Reverend Blackwood wrote in his private journal, "that I have never witnessed such a profound demonstration of what could only be described as spiritual empathy. The young woman appears to carry within herself an ability to absorb and transform the suffering of others. While this might be viewed as a gift from the Almighty, I cannot reconcile it with any biblical precedent." Dr. Aldridge, meanwhile, had begun conducting more systematic tests of Latoya's apparent abilities. With her consent, he arranged for her to meet with patients while he observed from behind a screen, taking detailed notes on her responses and the subsequent effects on those she encountered. The results consistently defied conventional medical understanding. During one session, she was introduced to Mr. Jeremiah Couch, a 70-year-old farmer who had been hospitalized for a persistent cough that had resisted all treatment. Within minutes of meeting Latoya, Mr. Couch began to speak about his experiences as a young man during the War of 1812, describing battles he had never previously mentioned to anyone. As he spoke, his cough gradually subsided, and by the end of the session, he was breathing more freely than he had in months. "It was as if she drew the poison from my lungs," Mr. Couch later explained to Dr. Aldridge. "Not just the sickness, but the memories I've carried for 30 years about friends who died in the war. I told her things I've never told my own wife, and somehow speaking them aloud made them easier to bear." Even more intriguing was Latoya's interaction with young Timothy Woodsworth, a 12-year-old boy who had been brought to the hospital after experiencing what his parents described as fits of madness. During these episodes, Timothy would speak in voices that weren't his own, describing events from the town's history that he had never learned. His parents, convinced that their son was possessed by demons, had sought both medical and spiritual intervention. When Latoya met Timothy, something extraordinary occurred. The boy's erratic behavior immediately stabilized, and he began to speak in the same unknown language that Latoya used. For nearly an hour, they carried on what appeared to be a conversation, with Timothy showing none of the confusion or distress that had characterized his condition. Dr. Aldridge, observing from his hidden position, noted that both individuals seemed to be speaking with knowledge and understanding that transcended their apparent ages and experiences. "The boy spoke of things that happened in this town before he was born," Dr. Aldridge recorded. "He described the location of graves in the old cemetery that even the church records don't mention. He spoke of families that lived here generations ago, of conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples, of secrets that have been buried for decades. Most disturbing of all, he spoke of these things not as historical facts he had learned, but as personal memories." When the session ended, Timothy returned to his normal state with no memory of the conversation. However, his episodes of madness ceased entirely, and within a week, his parents were able to take him home, fully recovered. The ministers viewed this as evidence of divine intervention, while Dr. Aldridge struggled to find a scientific explanation for what he had witnessed. The case took on new complexity when Dr. Brennan made another discovery in the Salem Historical Society's archives. Among the papers of a deceased minister named Reverend Josiah Mather, he found a collection of letters dated 1826 that described a young woman who had been living in the woods outside Millbrook. The letters written to a colleague in Boston detailed the Reverend's attempts to civilize and Christianize this individual whom he described as possessing heathen knowledge and speaking in tongues that predate the Tower of Babel. She claims to remember the stories of generations past, Reverend Mather had written, not as tales passed down through teaching, but as lived experiences. She speaks of the suffering of her people as if she had witnessed it personally, and demonstrates knowledge of healing practices that seem to draw upon forces beyond Christian understanding. "I fear that in my attempts to save her soul, I may have encountered something that challenges the very foundations of our faith." The letters revealed that Reverend Mather had spent 3 years working with this young woman, whom he referred to only as the child of many mothers. His final letter, dated December 1829, was brief and troubling. "I can no longer continue this work. The young woman has shown me truths about the nature of human suffering that I am not prepared to accept. I fear I have glimpsed something that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. I pray that God will forgive me for abandoning this task, but I can no longer serve as a bridge between her world and ours." Dr. Brennan shared this discovery with his colleagues, creating a new wave of speculation about Latoya's true identity and origins. The time frame aligned perfectly with the period following her disappearance from the Presbyterian family, suggesting a continuous narrative that spanned more than 2 decades. The hospital's atmosphere became increasingly charged as staff members began to report their own unusual experiences. Nurse Margaret Thornton claimed that she had begun experiencing vivid dreams about historical events in Millbrook, including details about the town's founding that she had never learned. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the hospital's oldest physician, reported that he had started remembering conversations with patients who had died years earlier, as if their voices were speaking to him through Latoya's presence. These reports created a growing sense of unease among the hospital staff. Some began to avoid Latoya's wing entirely, while others found themselves drawn to spend more time there, claiming they felt more connected to their work and more aware of their patients' deeper needs. The division between these two groups created tension that affected the hospital's daily operations. Dr. Aldridge found himself in the difficult position of maintaining medical objectivity while acknowledging that he was dealing with phenomena that seemed to transcend conventional science. His own experiences with Latoya had begun to affect his worldview in ways that concerned him. He had started to remember details about his own childhood that he had long forgotten, and he found himself understanding his patients' conditions with an intuitive insight that seemed to bypass his medical training. "I fear I am losing my scientific detachment," he confided to his private journal. "The young woman's presence has awakened something within me that I cannot name. I find myself seeing patients not merely as collections of symptoms to be treated, but as complex beings carrying the weight of their personal histories, their ancestral memories, and their deepest fears. This enhanced empathy makes me a more effective healer, but it also makes me question everything I thought I knew about the nature of human consciousness." The situation reached a critical point when Mrs. Hitchcock, the pneumonia patient who had initially requested to be moved near Latoya, made a revelation that would change the entire direction of the case. During what she thought would be her final night in the hospital, she asked to speak privately with Dr. Aldridge about something she had learned from her extended interactions with Latoya. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice weak but urgent, "I need to tell you something about what she's shown me. It's not just about my Samuel or about the past. She's shown me things about this town, about this very hospital that I think you need to know. There are secrets buried here, secrets that people have died to protect, and I think she knows where they're hidden." Mrs. Hitchcock's revelation sent shockwaves through the hospital's leadership. Dr. Aldridge immediately arranged for a private meeting with the dying woman while Reverend Whitmore insisted on being present to provide spiritual guidance. What they learned during that February evening would transform their understanding of both Latoya's case and the dark history of Millbrook itself. "She doesn't just remember the past," Mrs. Hitchcock explained, her breathing labored but her voice clear. "She carries it with her like a burden. During our conversations, she showed me things about this town that happened before any of us were born. She told me about the land this hospital was built on, about what happened here before the first brick was laid." According to Mrs. Hitchcock, Latoya had revealed that the Blessed Mercy Infirmary stood on what had once been a sacred burial ground used by the indigenous Pennacook people. The area had been considered so spiritually significant that tribal elders had performed ceremonies there to honor not only their own ancestors, but also the spirits of those who had suffered and died in the region, including enslaved people who had been brought to Massachusetts in the early days of the colony. "She spoke of bones beneath the foundation," Mrs. Hitchcock continued. "Not just native bones, but the remains of people who died in chains, who were buried without Christian rites, who were forgotten by history. She said their spirits had been calling out for recognition, for justice, for someone to remember their names and their stories." Dr. Aldridge felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. The hospital's construction records from 1834 had mentioned the discovery of irregular burial remains during the excavation, but Reverend Whitmore had ordered them to be quietly relocated to make way for the foundation. The minister's face had gone pale at Mrs. Hitchcock's words, confirming what Dr. Aldridge had begun to suspect. "There's more," Mrs. Hitchcock whispered. "She told me about a doctor who worked here in the early days, Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood, Reverend Blackwood's own father. He was conducting experiments on patients, particularly those who were brought here against their will. Runaway slaves, native people who had been captured, immigrants who had no families to protect them. He was trying to understand what he called the primitive mind. And he kept detailed records of everything he did. The implications were staggering. If Latoya's revelations were accurate, the hospital had been built on a foundation of both literal and metaphorical graves, and its early years had been marked by medical practices that violated every principle of Christian charity. Dr. Aldridge realized that he needed to investigate these claims, but he also understood that doing so could destroy the institution that employed him. Over the following days, he began a careful search of the hospital's oldest records, stored in the basement archives. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden among routine medical reports and administrative documents, he discovered a collection of leather-bound journals bearing the name Drive N. Blackwood, volumes that detailed experiments and procedures that would have been considered horrific even by the standards of 1847. Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood had indeed conducted unauthorized medical experiments on vulnerable patients. His journals described attempts to map what he called racial characteristics of pain response, procedures designed to test the limits of human endurance, and detailed studies of how different ethnic groups reacted to various forms of psychological torture. Most disturbing of all, he had specifically sought out patients who claimed to possess spiritual abilities or cultural knowledge that differed from Christian tradition. I have identified several specimens who demonstrate what can only be described as heathen enlightenment. One entry read, "These individuals, primarily of African or native origin, exhibit heightened sensitivity to stimuli that do not affect Christian patients. By subjecting them to controlled conditions of stress, I hope to isolate the source of their unnatural abilities and determine whether such traits can be eliminated through proper medical intervention." The journals revealed that Dr. Blackwood had been particularly interested in patients who spoke in unknown languages or demonstrated knowledge of historical events they couldn't possibly have witnessed. His treatments involved a combination of physical restraint, sensory deprivation, and what he termed spiritual realignment, procedures designed to break the connection between patients and their cultural or ancestral memories. Most chilling of all was his final entry, dated November 15, 1838. "The young woman brought to us from the woods has proven resistant to all conventional treatments. Her ability to access memories that appear to span generations has only grown stronger despite our interventions. I have concluded that she represents a form of human development that is incompatible with Christian civilization. For the safety of our community, I recommend that she be permanently confined to prevent the spread of her influence." Dr. Aldridge realized with growing horror that Dr. Blackwood's young woman from the woods could only be Latoya herself. The timeline aligned perfectly with Reverend Mather's letters and the period following her disappearance from the Presbyterian family. She had been captured, brought to the hospital, and subjected to procedures designed to destroy her identity and abilities. But the journals also revealed something else. Dr. Blackwood had failed. His final entries described increasing problems with the hospital's operations, staff members reporting disturbing dreams and visions, and a growing sense that the building itself has been contaminated by heathen influence. The doctor had died suddenly in December 1838, reportedly from a heart attack, but his private notes suggested he had been experiencing severe psychological disturbances in the weeks before his death. The boundaries between past and present have begun to blur, his penultimate entry revealed. "I find myself remembering things that happened to my patients as if they were my own experiences. I dream of chains and whips, of children torn from their mothers' arms, of ceremonies conducted in languages I do not understand. I fear that in my attempts to eliminate her unnatural abilities, I have somehow become infected by them." Dr. Aldridge shared these discoveries with Reverend Whitmore, who was forced to confront the terrible truth about his hospital's history. The minister had known about the burial ground and had approved the removal of the remains, but he had been unaware of Dr. Blackwood's experiments. The revelation that his institution had been built on a foundation of suffering and had participated in systematic torture of vulnerable patients challenged everything he believed about his mission. "We must make this right," Reverend Whitmore declared, his voice heavy with guilt and determination. "If this young woman has indeed been carrying the weight of these injustices for nearly a decade, then we have a Christian duty to acknowledge what has been done and seek redemption." But as they prepared to confront Latoya with what they had learned, the hospital experienced a series of events that suggested the situation was far more complex than they had imagined. Patients throughout the building began reporting shared dreams, visions of historical events that seemed to be connected to the institution's dark past. Staff members found themselves experiencing memories that didn't belong to them, and the building itself seemed to be responding to the growing awareness of its hidden history. Doors opened and closed without explanation. The temperature in Latoya's wing fluctuated wildly despite the season, and several staff members reported hearing voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify. Dr. Aldridge began to realize that Latoya's presence had awakened something that had been dormant for nearly a decade, the accumulated spiritual weight of all those who had suffered and died on the hospital grounds. The crisis reached its peak when Reverend Blackwood, who had been struggling with his own family's connection to the hospital's dark history, approached Dr. Aldridge with a confession that would change everything they thought they knew about the case. "I need to tell you something about my father," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Something that I've kept hidden for nearly 30 years. He didn't die of a heart attack. He took his own life. But not before he told me about the young woman he had been treating. He said she had shown him things about our family's past that he couldn't bear to live with. He said she had made him remember the sins of our ancestors and that he could no longer face the weight of that knowledge." The revelation that Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood had committed suicide after being confronted with the full scope of his family's historical participation in slavery and genocide added another layer of complexity to the case. It suggested that Latoya's ability to access ancestral memories wasn't limited to her own heritage, but could extend to anyone who came into contact with her. As the hospital staff struggled to process these revelations, they realized that they were dealing with something far more significant than a single patient's mental health crisis. Latoya represented a living connection to the suppressed history of their community, a repository of memories that included not only the suffering of the oppressed, but also the guilt of the oppressors. Her presence had awakened the accumulated spiritual debt of generations, and now everyone connected to the hospital would be forced to confront the true cost of their ancestors' actions. The question that haunted Dr. Aldridge as he prepared for what he knew would be a final confrontation with Latoya was whether acknowledging this history would bring healing or destruction. The young woman had already demonstrated that she could affect the mental and physical health of everyone around her. But what would happen when she was finally given the opportunity to share the full truth about what she had experienced and witnessed? On the morning of February 20, 1847, Dr. Aldridge made a decision that would define the remainder of his career and fundamentally alter the lives of everyone at the Blessed Mercy Infirmary. He gathered the hospital's senior staff, the 3 ministers, and a select group of the most stable patients in the main chapel, where he announced his intention to allow Latoya to speak freely about her experiences for the first time since her arrival. "We have spent weeks trying to understand this young woman's condition through the lens of medical science and Christian doctrine," he addressed the assembled group. "But I believe we have been asking the wrong questions. Instead of trying to cure her or contain her, we need to listen to what she has been trying to tell us about the history of this place and the people who have suffered here." Latoya entered the chapel wearing a simple white dress provided by the hospital, but her demeanor was transformed from the quiet, compliant patient they had known. She moved with a confidence and dignity that seemed to emanate from deep within her, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed centuries of human experience. "I am not one person," she began, her words clear and precise. "I am the keeper of memories that others have chosen to forget. I carry within me the voices of those who died without being heard, the stories of those who were erased from your history books, the pain of those who suffered in silence. What you call my condition, I call my purpose." She moved to the center of the chapel, and as she did, the temperature in the room seemed to shift, becoming both warmer and cooler simultaneously, as if different seasons were occupying the same space. Several people in the audience gasped as they felt what they later described as the presence of others, invisible figures standing alongside Latoya, filling the chapel with spirits that had been waiting decades to be acknowledged. "This building stands on sacred ground," Latoya continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that seemed to resonate in the very walls. "Before your ancestors built their hospital here, my people, and I claim kinship with all who have suffered, gathered in this place to honor the dead and heal the living. The Pennacook buried their sacred ones here, and later the bodies of enslaved people were hidden in this earth when their masters denied them proper burial." Dr. Aldridge felt his scientific skepticism crumbling as he watched the effect of her words on the assembled crowd. Patients who had been struggling with various ailments began to sit straighter, breathe more easily, as if some burden was being lifted from their shoulders. Staff members who had reported strange dreams and visions nodded in recognition as Latoya described experiences that matched their own. When Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood brought me here in 1838, he believed he could break the connection between my spirit and the ancestors who speak through me, she said, looking directly at Reverend Blackwood, whose face had gone ashen. He used instruments and techniques designed to sever the bonds that allow me to carry their memories. But suffering only deepened my ability to hold their stories. Every moment of pain he inflicted added another voice to the chorus I carry within me. The revelation that Latoya had been a prisoner in the hospital for months, subjected to experimental procedures designed to destroy her cultural identity, sent shockwaves through the audience. Several staff members began to weep as they realized they were working in an institution built on such systematic cruelty. Your father, Latoya addressed Reverend Blackwood directly, came to understand what he had done only in his final weeks. The memories I carry are not just of my own people's suffering, but of the pain inflicted by all who came before us. When he looked into my eyes during our last session, he saw not just the anguish of his victims, but the spiritual torment that comes from participating in such evil. He could not live with that knowledge. Reverend Blackwood stood up, his legs unsteady, tears streaming down his face. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How can we make amends for what has been done?" Latoya's expression softened, and for the first time since her arrival at the hospital, she smiled. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward healing," she said. "But true redemption requires action. The spirits that gather in this place are not seeking revenge. They are seeking recognition, remembrance, and a commitment that such suffering will not be forgotten or repeated." She moved toward the altar where Reverend Whitmore conducted his weekly services, and as she did, something extraordinary began to happen. The patients in the chapel started to speak, but not in their own voices. Mrs. Hitchcock, the pneumonia patient who had formed such a strong connection with Latoya, began to recite names, dozens of names, of people who had been buried on the hospital grounds without markers or acknowledgement. Young Timothy Woodsworth, the boy who had been considered possessed, stood and began to describe in perfect detail the layout of the original Pennacook burial ground, including the location of ceremonial artifacts that had been disturbed during the hospital's construction. Other patients, speaking in voices that seemed to come from beyond themselves, shared stories of families separated by slavery, of children who had died in captivity, of rituals and traditions that had been forbidden and forgotten. Dr. Aldridge realized he was witnessing something that transcended any medical or religious framework he had been trained to understand. The patients weren't exhibiting symptoms of mental illness. They were serving as conduits for historical testimony that had been suppressed for generations. Latoya had somehow created a space where the dead could finally speak through the living. "The healing you practice in this building," Latoya said, addressing the medical staff, "cannot be complete while it rests on a foundation of unacknowledged suffering. Every patient who enters here carries not only their own pain, but the inherited trauma of their ancestors. Until you recognize this truth, your treatments will only address the surface of human anguish." Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the hospital's oldest physician, stood up shakily and walked toward Latoya. "I have practiced medicine for 40 years, he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I have seen patients recover from ailments that should have killed them, and I have watched others die from conditions that seemed minor. I never understood why some people seem to carry burdens far greater than their individual circumstances could explain. You're telling us that healing requires addressing not just physical symptoms but generational wounds." "Yes," Latoya replied. "And it requires understanding that the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, are not as fixed as your science pretends. The ancestors live within us, and their unresolved pain becomes our pain. Their unfinished business becomes our burden. Only by honoring their stories and learning from their experiences can we hope to heal ourselves and our communities." Sister Mary Catherine, who had been observing quietly from the back of the chapel, stepped forward. "In my faith tradition, we believe in the communion of saints, the idea that the dead remain connected to the living through divine love. What you're describing sounds like a more complex version of that same truth. The spirits that speak through you aren't separate from us. They're part of the ongoing human story. Latoya nodded approvingly. Your understanding brings us closer to the truth. But this connection comes with responsibility. Those who carry ancestral memories, as I do, serve as bridges between worlds. We help the living understand the cost of forgetting, and we help the dead find peace through remembrance. The atmosphere in the chapel had become charged with an energy that everyone present could feel, but none could fully explain. Dr. Aldridge noticed that the light filtering through the windows seemed brighter, the air felt cleaner, and the constant background noise of the hospital's daily operations had faded to a peaceful silence. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. What will happen to you now? Dr. Aldridge asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. My work here is nearly complete, Latoya replied. The stories have been told, the acknowledgement has been given, and the commitment to change has been made. The spirits who have been waiting for recognition can begin to find peace, but the responsibility now passes to all of you. She reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew the brass locket that had been her only possession when she arrived. Opening it revealed not a portrait or keepsake, but a small amount of soil, earth that she explained had been taken from every sacred site where her people had been buried or forgotten. This contains the essence of all the places where suffering was transformed into wisdom, she said, placing the locket on the altar. As long as this remains here in a place of honor, the hospital will remember its true purpose, not just to heal individual bodies, but to address the wounds that span generations. Dr. Aldridge felt tears running down his cheeks as he began to understand the full scope of what had transpired. Latoya wasn't simply a patient with an unusual mental condition. She was a living repository of historical trauma who had been carrying the burden of collective memory, waiting for the right moment and the right people to help her share that load. Will we see you again? He asked. Latoya's smile was both sad and hopeful. You will see me in every patient who carries pain they cannot explain. In every family struggling with inherited trauma, in every community trying to heal from historical wounds. The work I do continues through others who are willing to listen to the voices that speak from the past. As she finished speaking, something remarkable happened. The patients who had been serving as conduits for ancestral voices began to return to their normal states, but they retained clear memories of what they had experienced. More importantly, they reported feeling lighter, as if burdens they hadn't known they were carrying had been lifted from their shoulders. Mrs. Hitchcock later described the experience as the most profound spiritual encounter of my life. She said that after serving as a voice for the unnamed dead, she felt a deeper connection not only to her deceased husband, but to the entire human community. Her pneumonia symptoms, which had resisted all medical treatment, disappeared completely within days of the chapel gathering. Young Timothy Woodsworth's parents reported that their son's episodes of madness never returned, but he retained an unusual sensitivity to historical sites and an ability to comfort others who were experiencing grief or trauma. Dr. Aldridge would later write that the boy seemed to have inherited a portion of Latoya's gift for serving as a bridge between the living and the dead. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in Dr. Aldridge himself. The experience in the chapel had fundamentally altered his understanding of medicine, healing, and the nature of human consciousness. He began to develop treatment approaches that addressed not only physical symptoms but the psychological and spiritual dimensions of illness, methods that would later influence the development of what would become known as holistic medicine. In the days following the chapel gathering, the Blessed Mercy Infirmary underwent a transformation that amazed both staff and patients. The building itself seemed to breathe more easily, as if a weight that had been pressing down on it for decades had finally been lifted. Patients recovered more quickly. Staff worked with renewed purpose, and the atmosphere of tension that had characterized the hospital for weeks gave way to a sense of peace and healing. Dr. Aldridge spent long hours documenting everything that had occurred, creating a detailed record that would serve as both medical case study and historical testimony. However, he soon discovered that the political and religious climate of 1847 Massachusetts was not ready to accept the implications of what had transpired at the hospital. Within a week of the chapel gathering, Reverend Whitmore received visits from several prominent community leaders, including the mayor of Millbrook and representatives from the Massachusetts Medical Society. They had heard rumors about unusual practices at the hospital and demanded explanations for reports of patients speaking in unknown languages and claims about the building's history. "We cannot allow this institution to become associated with heathen practices or spiritualist nonsense," Mayor Harrison Blackwell declared during an emergency meeting with the hospital's leadership. "The reputation of our community depends on maintaining proper Christian standards in all our civic institutions." Dr. Aldridge found himself in an impossible position. The evidence of what had occurred was undeniable. Patients had recovered from conditions that had resisted all conventional treatment, and the hospital's overall functioning had improved dramatically. Yet, he could not explain these improvements without acknowledging phenomena that challenged both medical orthodoxy and religious doctrine. The political pressure intensified when several family members of former patients began asking uncomfortable questions about their loved ones' treatment during the early years of the hospital's operation. Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood's journals had revealed systematic abuse that could have resulted in criminal charges if the doctor had still been alive. The current leadership faced the possibility of legal action and public scandal if the full truth about the hospital's history became widely known. It was Latoya herself who provided a solution to this dilemma. On the morning of February 28, exactly 6 weeks after her arrival, she requested a private meeting with Dr. Aldridge. When he arrived at her room, he found her packing the few belongings she had acquired during her stay. "It's time for me to leave," she said simply. "My work here is finished, and my continued presence would only create problems for you in the hospital." Dr. Aldridge protested, arguing that she still needed medical care and that the hospital owed her compensation for the suffering she had endured. But Latoya's response revealed the depth of her wisdom and her understanding of the political realities they faced. "The healing that needed to happen has occurred," she explained. "The spirits have been acknowledged. The truth has been spoken, and those who were ready to hear it have received the message. Forcing others to accept what they're not prepared to understand would only create resistance and undo the progress that has been made." She handed him a letter she had written addressed to the hospital's board of directors. In it, she formally released the institution from any responsibility for her care and requested that her medical records be sealed to protect the privacy of all involved. She also included specific instructions for honoring the sacred nature of the burial ground beneath the hospital and recommendations for treatment approaches that would address the psychological and spiritual dimensions of illness. "What will you do now?" Dr. Aldridge asked, though he suspected that Latoya's future was as mysterious as her past. "I will continue the work I have always done," she replied. "There are other places where the dead need to speak through the living, other communities that need to confront their hidden histories. The gift I carry is not mine alone. It belongs to all those who are willing to serve as bridges between worlds." On the morning of March 1, 1847, Latoya simply disappeared. The night nurse reported that she had checked on her at midnight and found her sleeping peacefully. When the morning shift arrived, her bed was empty, her few possessions were gone, and there was no sign of how she had left the building. The only trace of her presence was the brass locket which remained on the chapel altar exactly where she had placed it. Dr. Aldridge spent the following months implementing the changes that Latoya had recommended. He established new protocols for patient care that emphasized the importance of understanding each individual's family history and cultural background. He created support groups for patients dealing with what he termed inherited trauma, and developed treatment approaches that combined medical intervention with spiritual and psychological healing. Most significantly, he worked with Reverend Whitmore to create a memorial garden on the hospital grounds dedicated to all those who had been buried there without recognition. The garden included markers bearing the names that had been spoken during the chapel gathering, along with a central monument acknowledging the sacred nature of the land and the hospital's commitment to honoring all who had suffered there. These changes had a profound impact on the hospital's effectiveness. Patient outcomes improved dramatically. Staff turnover decreased, and the institution gained a reputation for providing care that addressed not just physical symptoms but the deeper sources of human suffering. However, the true nature of these improvements was never publicly acknowledged. Dr. Aldridge's official reports described Latoya as a patient suffering from dissociative disorder who responded well to therapeutic intervention. Her ability to affect other patients was attributed to the power of positive psychology and the importance of peer support in the healing process. The chapel gathering was recorded as a successful experiment in group therapy that demonstrated the value of allowing patients to share their experiences in a supportive environment. These sanitized accounts satisfied the hospital's critics and allowed the institution to continue its work without political interference. However, Dr. Aldridge maintained detailed private records of what had actually occurred, hoping that future generations would be better prepared to understand and accept the deeper truths about healing and human consciousness that Latoya had revealed. The three ministers who had witnessed the event struggled with their own interpretations of what they had experienced. Reverend Blackwood spent months researching his family's history and eventually established a fund to support the education of children from families that had been affected by slavery. Reverend Marsh incorporated elements of what he had learned about inherited trauma into his sermons, helping his congregation understand how the sins of previous generations could affect contemporary families. Reverend Whitmore became an advocate for what he called integrative healing, arguing that true medicine must address the spiritual and psychological dimensions of human suffering. The patients who had participated in the chapel gathering carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Many reported that the event had fundamentally changed their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. They developed unusual sensitivity to others' pain and an ability to provide comfort to those dealing with grief or trauma. Some became informal healers in their communities, helping others process difficult family histories and inherited wounds. Dr. Aldridge continued to practice medicine for another 30 years, but his approach was forever changed by his encounters with Latoya. He became a pioneer in what would later be called holistic medicine, emphasizing the importance of treating patients as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms. His methods influenced a generation of physicians who would go on to develop more comprehensive approaches to healing. Most remarkably, several of these doctors reported encountering patients who seemed to possess abilities similar to Latoya, individuals who carried ancestral memories, who could sense the deeper sources of others' pain, and who seemed to serve as bridges between the living and the dead. These cases were rarely documented in official medical records, but they suggested that Latoya's gift was not unique, that there were others carrying similar burdens and serving similar purposes. In 1877, 30 years after Latoya's disappearance, Dr. Aldridge received a letter from a colleague in Ohio who described treating a young woman who matched Latoya's description and demonstrated identical abilities. Similar reports came from hospitals in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, always involving a woman of mixed ancestry who appeared to be in her 20s, who spoke in unknown languages, and who helped patients and staff confront difficult truths about their personal and collective histories. Dr. Aldridge began to suspect that Latoya was part of a larger phenomenon, a network of individuals who carried the responsibility for preserving and sharing suppressed memories. Whether they were all manifestations of the same consciousness or separate individuals with similar gifts remained a mystery that he would never solve. He spent his final years compiling his records and reflecting on the implications of what he had witnessed. In his last journal entry, written just before his death in 1889, he offered his ultimate conclusion about the case that had defined his career. I have come to believe that what we witnessed in 1847 was not an anomaly but a glimpse into the true nature of human consciousness and community. We are not separate individuals but part of an interconnected web of experience that spans generations. Those like Latoya who can access this deeper level of connection serve a vital function. They help us remember what we have chosen to forget, heal wounds that span centuries, and maintain the bonds that connect us to our ancestors and our descendants. Modern medicine focuses on treating individual symptoms. But true healing requires addressing the collective trauma that shapes our communities and our world. The brass locket remained on the chapel altar until the hospital was demolished in 1923 to make way for a modern medical facility. According to the demolition records, the locket was never found among the building's artifacts, leading some to speculate that it had been taken by someone who understood its significance. Others believed that it had simply returned to the earth from which it came, its purpose fulfilled. Today, the site where the Blessed Mercy Infirmary once stood is occupied by a small park. Few visitors know about the building's history or the extraordinary events that occurred there in 1847. However, those who are sensitive to such things report feeling an unusual sense of peace in the area, as if the land itself remembers the healing that took place and continues to offer comfort to those who need it. The story of Latoya's case raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the reality of ancestral memory, and the possibility that some individuals serve as living bridges between past and present. Whether these phenomena have natural explanations that science has yet to discover, or whether they represent genuine contact with spiritual realms, remains a matter of personal interpretation. What cannot be disputed is the transformative effect that Latoya's presence had on everyone who encountered her. The patients who met her, the staff who cared for her, and the community leaders who had to grapple with the implications of her revelations, all reported that the experience fundamentally changed their understanding of healing, human connection, and the importance of acknowledging difficult truths about the past. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrates that healing, whether individual or collective, requires more than treating surface symptoms. True recovery demands that we confront the deeper sources of pain, acknowledge the ways that historical trauma continues to affect present-day communities, and create spaces where suppressed voices can finally be heard and honored. The mystery of who Latoya really was, how she acquired her extraordinary abilities, and where she went after leaving the hospital may never be solved. But her legacy lives on in the lives she touched and the understanding she shared about the complex relationship between past and present, between individual suffering and collective healing, and between the medical treatment of symptoms and the deeper work of addressing the spiritual and psychological wounds that span generations. This terrifying case reminds us that some of history's most important lessons come not from those who held power, but from those who carried the burden of remembering what others chose to forget. In our modern world where we often focus on moving forward and leaving the past behind, Latoya's story suggests that true progress requires looking backward as well, acknowledging the suffering that came before us, honoring those who have been forgotten, and recognizing that the dead continue to speak through the living in ways that science is only beginning to understand. What do you think about this disturbing case from 1847 Massachusetts? Do you believe that some people can truly carry ancestral memories? Or do you think there's a more conventional explanation for what the doctors witnessed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has given you chills, make sure to subscribe to my channel Roots of Fear and hit that notification bell for more dark mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about human consciousness and the hidden connections between past and present. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying stories are often those that force us to question the very nature of reality itself.